So narrowing down the topic, you could, this is an example that Olivia put together. So you start from mental health here, and then you talk maybe a narrower specific thing, depression and anxiety, and then you could ask who are the potential subjects, and what is this, what you're trying to study, in what context, when and why, and then you could potentially narrow it down to something like how does the ability to get help affects depression and anxiety during social interaction among LGBT immigrants in New York City. That's a fair topic. um, I would say it's on the narrower side of things, like in terms of um, how narrow you want to go. This is as narrow as you want to go, but you want to probably hit somewhere a little broader than that. Um, are there any topics that you have thought about? Like, what is an example topic that you guys have thought about?
I'm interested in the neural correlates of divergent thinking, meaning like creativity, curiosity, and boredom.
Okay.
I mean, there's a specific paper that I had in mind.
Okay.
But it's pretty broad.
Yeah, no, that's nice.
On every single one of them.
That's a good place to start, right? You could maybe focus on one of them, right? And then think about the neural mechanisms of maybe creative thinking or other.
I'm really interested in the default mode network.
Default mode network. Okay. So yeah, so you could narrow it down as you read. Like even reading one or two papers, if you find the right review paper, then you could narrow it down based on what you learn, and then think about, so is there some signature in the default mode network that tells you how creative a person would potentially be? Maybe that's a topic. Maybe the role of default mode network in creative individuals, something like that. Or is default mode network, we didn't talk about this, but this is something. So let's say you're recording fMRI from people, like a lot of time we show them some images, or we play a sound, or they're doing a task, and you record their activity based on certain events, right? The image comes up, what is the activity 4 or 5 seconds later? But when they're not doing anything, when subjects are not doing anything, the brain is active, right? The brain is never dead. We talked about there's a baseline activity on a neural level, but there is activity on a network level too. You could look at what areas are talking to each other when you're sitting there and thinking about something, when you're daydreaming, when you're ruminating about something, and you're not doing a specific task that the experiment gave you. And that type of activity, you call it a default mode network. Now, you could say, well, does the default mode network activity or some signature of that network, how widespread it is maybe, um, is that predictive of people's creativity? Something like that. That's a nice topic. You could find maybe 4 or 5 papers on it, and then try to summarize that, right? That's nice. So again, this is just one guideline, but you could definitely come up with different. Are there other examples anyone have thought about? Yeah.
I'm a teacher at elementary school, and so there's a lot of talk now, like trend of the science of reading,
Mm-hmm.
based on the science of reading.
Okay.
So I'm interested in learning what, not like what educators or like the flavor of the moment is, like those articles, but what psychologists and neuropsychologists have to say about what happens in the brain when kids are.
Okay, that's great. Yeah, I think the neuroscience of reading, in a sense that, or reading, or maybe learning math or something like that in kids, and I think that's a nice area. I know of some work in that area, but that's great. Yeah, you could definitely read a few papers on. Um, Again, this is the topic, right? Neural mechanisms of learning how to read in children, right? You could read a few papers on that, and then discuss what are potential neural mechanisms that people have shown that correlates with better ability to read, for example, right? And you could always find papers where, I don't know how developed that side of things are where they could tell you whether they could actually give you interventions for kids that are struggling. Is that, I don't know, you would probably know if you're going down that road, you could probably find a paper that tries to approach it from that angle. Do we know if a person is struggling based on some markers, biomarkers or brain marker, and then can we help them based on that? Yeah, I think that's a good topic.
I have a question.
Hmm?
How hard are you going to look at those of us who read your article and presented on that one?
I don't think anyone does it. That's that's just there for a test. I see who does it. I'll suspect. That's that's not an easy article to read. No, it's not. It's so my research is very computational, and it's not something that it's just there. If somebody wants to learn about how you approach the whole thing from a computational point of view, then it's there if you want to read it, if you want to look at it. It's not really, there's no expectation that you would. And part of the reason I'm giving you all those options is because I want you to pick one that you like and you find manageable and you find interesting, so you could do the best you could do on it. Yeah, but it's just there if somebody wants to know um, the stuff that we're talking about, how you would approach the whole thing from an end-to-end computational perspective, right? A system that could actually have a visual processing computationally, but also make actions computational.
I didn't realize it was your paper until I had gotten into it, and I was like, oh no.
Did you do it on that?
Yeah.
Okay. I did um I did watch, like, I'm not gonna grade them, but I do watch bits and pieces of, and that's how I know some of you have not said the axis right. Uh, I do watch bits and pieces of the presentations, and kind of it's nice to see how you present or how you use the terminology, um, and whether you're comfortable with it, right? And that's nice to see. I watch some of them. Okay. Any questions about are you all feel good about it? Are you all starting to think, I hope, like a topic that you all have aspirations, I imagine, being in this program to go on and maybe do a PhD or do research. So there must be something that really that excites you about this. And hopefully you could find the right topic that relates to that, but also relates to the topic that we talk about in order to get deeper on it. And then this is something that you could, it's a nice size paper. You could put it on some platform and be like, oh, I researched this topic, or so it's something that you could show potentially if you're applying for something, if you do a nice job with it. Right? The the topic is due. Why am I signing that? Okay, I don't have network here, so let's just move on from this. I wanted just to say that the topic is due in about 2 weeks, so try to start working on it earlier. So back to attention. we started talking about this topic last week, and we're going to just try to finish it today. Um, we talked about selective attention. I mentioned a couple of experiments. I had a couple, like I got a couple of questions, and maybe I realized maybe I didn't spend enough time on the methodology of these experiments. So I'm just going to briefly do that. These are something that I would ask on the exam anyway. So in this example, I said, in this experiment, I talked about how we're looking at the effect of a spatial attention. And the task is very simple. The task is you get a cue. The cue is correct. And something I didn't mention, for example, last time, is that the cue is correct 80% of the time. If it wasn't correct, maybe certain percentage of the time, people would ignore it completely, right? So the cue is correct 80% of the time. In this case, it's a valid cue. It's a correct cue that when the cue points to the right direction, the light appears there. The subject's task is to respond as soon as they see the light. But the light is very bright. It's not a light that is hard to detect. And the subjects are instructed to keep fixations at the center. That's why you don't want the eye movement to interfere with it. And you want them, what we call, to covertly attend to it, but I'll talk about that next week. Now, 80% of the time, the cue is valid. 20% of the time, the cue is invalid. What makes it invalid is that the cue points you to a certain direction, but the light is appearing in the other direction. That means that for people to respond to it, when you see this cue, because 80% of the time, the light appears on the side that the cue points to, people are likely to focus their attention, try to attentively select that part of the visual world, which is on the left side, and the light appears on the other side. And 50% of the time, so you have, let's say you have 200 trials, 100 of them would be neutral cues. So imagine 50%, and then the 100 of them would be, non-neutral cue. 80 of them would be correct. 20 of them would be, 80 would be valid. 20 would be invalid, for example. Then you get this behavioral pattern. So the behavioral pattern is reaction time from the moment that the light appears to the moment that the subject presses the button, that yes, I am seeing the light. And what you would expect is that in the case where the cue is valid, in that 80% of the time when the cue is non-neutral, then you would expect people to be faster. So the reaction time would be slower. Is this clear what this paradigm is? Right? I feel like maybe I didn't explain it well last time. But it's a simple paradigm to just show that when people have an expectation that the light will more likely appear in a certain side, they would spatially attend to that area, and that the spatial attention facilitates the processing of information from that specific area. So that's the effect of a spatial attention. When you're spatially attending to a certain area, you facilitate the processing of information coming from that area. So you respond faster to information coming from that area versus areas that you're not attending to. And when the cue is invalid, there's a cost, right? The invalid cue is worse than the neutral cue. It takes you longer to respond when the cue is invalid, when the cue is neutral. And that's because there's a cost, because you're spatially attending to a certain location, and for you to orient that attention back to the other side, that takes a little time, versus when the cue is not, when the cue is neutral, so you're not spatially attending to a specific area. Yeah. So if I ask you, explain what this experiment was and what behavioral pattern they got and what does it mean for attention, you kind of know what kind of question I would ask. You should be able to answer that. And this is, as I said, this is a spatial attention. This is the type of attention when you're attending to a specific area in a space, and that's how you facilitate the processing of information from that area.
How did they form the expectation?
How, like what?
Like the expectation.
So you expect when you get a cue like this, you expect the light to appear on this side, right? This is the prior frame. This is the new frame, let's say. Yeah, because you get a cue, and whenever you get a cue in a certain direction, 80% of the time, that light actually appears in that direction. So when you get a cue in that direction, you're expecting the light to appear in that direction. And that's your expectation. And that expectation makes you, well, I'm going to tend to this area because I expect the light to appear in this area. With this experiment, we talked about inattentional blindness. And I said the paradigm is, well, people are doing some attention demanding tasks. The paradigm is much more complicated than that, but for simplicity, I said we have an attention demanding task. The task is, which line is longer? Is it the horizontal line or is it the vertical line? And occasionally, when this thing comes up, so whenever this thing comes up, it immediately goes down. It's a very brief presentation. But sometimes when it comes up with a distractor, with another object, and people are asked what the object is. Now, what is difficult about what makes this paradigm kind of complicated? Meaning that so let's say this happens in one, like let's say you do 3-4 trials of these, right? The image comes up, you decide, and then it goes down, and then you press horizontal or vertical. You're saying, well, vertical was longer here. Next trial comes up, goes down, a brief presentation. You're saying, well, the vertical was longer or horizontal was longer. Then 3-4 trials later, something like this comes up. The cross comes up and the shape comes up with it. And then they go down and then they ask you which one was longer. Then they ask you, oh, did you notice that there was another object in that scene other than the cross? And then you say yes or no. And then they're like, okay, what was that object? And then you say, well, I don't know. Maybe it was this one. Now, what is the problem with that paradigm? Let's say another block, I do the same thing, and then I do the same thing. What is the problem with that? Okay, no, so yeah, the problem is that when you do it once, like I cannot show you the invisible gorilla video again, right? Because any inattentional blindness experiment has this problem that if you have done it once, right, you're never going to be blind to that object anymore, right? So you cannot really do this. It means that with every subject, you only get one trial that has inattentional blindness in it, right? That's the problem with it. Like you have to do this experiment across lots and lots of subjects. Because next time, whenever something appears, they're going to expect to look for the second object too. You know, that's their expectation at that point. They know there's an attention demanding task, but some trials, another object may appear and they may be asked about it. So, so the problem with a paradigm like this is that you can only do it once. One trial is truly inattentional blindness for any given subject. But when you get it right, and it's truly inattentional blindness, you get the paradigm, you get the result that you expect, where people are really not able to recognize it because they're doing another task and they completely miss that object. Okay, these two again, just to give you an idea of some of these paradigms are hard to study experimentally, and you know it takes a lot of clever design to really single out a small effect or something that you're really interested in. Something that doesn't, as a psychologist, if you do experimental psychology, something that you have to deal with a lot. All right, after that, we talked about this experiment from Moran and Desimone. And the message of this experiment, and some of you read a paper from Desimone for this assignment, right? This is the paper about object decoding from the infratemporal cortex. And that paper kind of goes deeper into this concept of what does it mean where there are object clutters, and what does it mean for the representation in area IT, right? When you have multiple objects in the environment, when you attend to one of them, you're basically biasing the competition in favor of that object. And when you're biasing the competition in favor of that object, it's likely that the higher visual areas represent that object. So attention in that context, it's like a gatekeeping. It's like a gate that lets certain things go up the hierarchy. And that's where I said it becomes like awareness and conscious experience and just plays into much more higher level stuff. But even in early visual areas, where the very early visual areas, maybe areas in, and when I say that, you kind of have an idea of what that means. It means like LGN, maybe area V1, maybe V2. But when you go higher up the ventral pathway, you go to V4, IT, those areas become much more selective in some ways, right? When you're attending to one object, the representation in those areas become more tuned. They try to represent the attended object. So if you had an algorithm to decode those features, and I'll talk about decoding more in the context of actions and whatnot. Some of you read the paper on decoding actions from brain activity, and so you'll kind of have an idea of what that means. And if you're decoding, meaning that you're basically looking at neural activity in a certain area and you're trying to classify what is the object that they're attending to. That tells you something. If you can do that, it means that attending to an object changes the representation in certain brain area in a way that you could tell.
What tools do they use to decode that data?
So depends on the best, I guess, machine learning methods of the time. Because imagine you have neural activity, and what does neural activity look like? Well, depends on what type of neural activity it is. In that paper, let's say it's single cell neurophysiology, right? They're decoding from single cells. So you have this spiking data. So if you have a spiking data from, let's say, 100 neurons, it's a really complex time series, because then you could translate that spiking data to firing rates. And you've seen how that looks like. You could just, it looks like a stock price when you look at firing rate. Like if you look at the stock price of a company, it goes up and down and whatnot, right? So these are time series. Now you have to decode that time series to an object. What you do is that you show all these objects. This is a long answer. You show these different objects in isolation. Then you look at the neural activity in that brain area. Then when you show them with other objects and they get 10, you could look at that neural activity and see how similar that neural activity is to the neural activities that you got from each object in isolation. Does that make sense? So if let's say I give them an object of a chair, I look at the pattern of neural activity, and you could look at that pattern the way we've looked at, like a raster plot, or you could look at them as firing rate. It goes up and down. Then you record that for each object individually. Then when they're together, they're 10 to 1, and you see how similar the neural activity becomes to each of them. At that point, you have to use a classifier. Classifier is a machine learning method where you can say what class an input is, like what you have on your phone classifies faces, or class, like you're all now familiar with some of the more modern object recognition tools and that are integrated in ChatGPT and other maybe browsers and your phones and everything. Um, those are classifiers, and those are more modern classifiers, and they're based on neural networks. You basically give it an image, and like it happens in the visual pathway, that image becomes pixels, those pixels become features with edge orientation, then it's a hierarchy, and then you classify that as belonging to a category or not. We'll talk about decoding in that sense of how you go from neural activity to one or other action, maybe next week. We're not going to be able to get into details of what is the exact process of how do you look at neural activity and then say, well, they're thinking of a cow or they're thinking of a chair. We're not going to get into the exact details of it, but you have to, you have an idea, right? Did you follow how I described it? In a sense that you just want to know how the neural activity looks like when you look at them on isolation, and then when they're imagining it, or when they're looking at a new picture, you could tell how similar that neural activity is to one of those that you recorded prior to that. Something like that. Questions? So decoding is an interesting topic in a sense that you could use it for research purposes, but also we'll talk about how you could use it for brain-computer interface, right? People, you read the paper, if you read the paper on tetraplegia, that's an application where if you understand what this neural activity is, then you could decode it to a certain action. How do you do that? Well, similarly, you ask the person to imagine moving their arm forward. You ask the person to imagine moving their arm to the right, to the left, right? You ask them to imagine those things and you record the neural activity. Then later on, when they imagine it, you see how similar it is to each of those conditions. If that neural activity is similar to moving to the right, well, you move it to the right. So it's all about pattern classification. But in order to classify patterns, you have to have training data, and training data are those things that I'm describing. Well, you ask them to do certain things and you record it. You have to know what's the mapping is between a neural activity and an action, or neural activity and a perception initially. Then in a new environment, you could try to predict. Okay, so this study was really about how attention can bias processing. Not everything gets to be processed fully. Like the world is a complex place. We have a limited amount of, brain power, and we try to optimize it. So the brain always is doing these trade-offs. You want to optimize for something, but that always comes at a cost. And what seems to be optimal for animals like us in an environment like this is that you want to be able to focus and process one thing with more clarity and with more depth. And that comes at a cost for a lot of other stuff. And attention does that. It biases processing for one thing versus other stuff. You talked about this study on object-based attention, which is basically instead of attending to a specific location in a space, you're prioritizing processing based on the category of the object. You're saying, well, I'm attending to houses versus I'm attending to faces. And because you're attending to houses, those cells in your brain that are representing houses, they would become more active because while you're gating information to come from the house, or you're gating information to come from the face. And that information gets routed to a specific area in the brain. Okay? So what is new? Today we're gonna talk a lot more about serial and parallel processing. Now, a lot of you have some intuition on this. There are things that we could do in parallel, and there are things that really requires us to serially attend to stuff that you want to say, okay, this, that. So it's a very different types of experience for us when something's serial, something's parallel. Now, as it turns out, a lot of operations that happen in the brain are a combination of these things. That you have a lot of parallel processing in the environment, and then you could serially extend that processing or contextualize that processing or select the specific information from that parallel processing. Okay, an example of parallel processing that I mentioned and you should be all familiar with is the fact that we have these feature detectors in the visual cortex. And these feature detectors are processing the environment in parallel, right? No amount of attention going to change that. No amount of top-down bias going to change that. That when I'm looking at the environment, there are edges in the environment. All of them are being processed, and they're being processed by different patches of neurons in my brain. Orientation analysis occurs simultaneously across the entire visual field in parallel. And you know where that is. This is, for example, in early visual areas in V1, where you have edge detectors and other orientation detectors in parallel. Now, if you scan a visual field for a reason, if I say, well, how many players are in this baseball field, or you know, if I ask you another question, what is does anyone know what city is this? It's Pittsburgh. Who's the Pittsburgh? Okay, yeah, um, it is Pittsburgh, and and there are these processing that you do, and we have experience with them, we have intuition with them, where we really have to go one by one. We cannot really look at an image and be like, that many, or this is the answer. There's a famous study that kind of started a lot of these eye movement based processing from Yarbus. And what he did, he showed people an image of a famous painting and asked them different questions. And he was recording their eye movements as they were looking. Now, some of you read the eye movement paper, right? And what you know now is, and we'll talk about eye movement more next week, but with eye movement, you could actually have cameras. Now, the technology has improved a lot over the years. This was much harder to do 50, 60 years ago. But now you could have cameras, right? There are devices where you have cameras facing directly the eye, or you have cameras that are sitting on a table. There are different versions of it. A lot of more new technology have cameras and eye trackers integrated into glasses where you could walk around with it. What they do is that, well, you could see what happens when you move your eye around, like there is a visible change in visual features, right? And if you calibrate that and you train that model, as I was describing, right, you could actually have an eye tracker. An eye tracker tells you where in the image is this person looking at. And then a lot of the experiments that you're going to come across in your study is going to be based on eye tracking, where you're recording where people are looking. So he's based on this image, they're recording where people are looking. So when you ask them different questions, right? If you ask people what are the ages of the people here, well, they have a certain patterns. They're going to look at faces mostly, right? If you ask them, how long has the unexpected visitor been away? And this is the name of the painting, The Unexpected Visitor. How long has the unexpected visitor been away? Well, you're going to go back and forth between the faces, right? So it's serial processing. A lot of time is about gathering information, right? You want to do a task and you have to gather information in a certain pattern. And that's how you do serial processing. It's serial in a way that you have to do one by one. You can't just look at this image and answer all those questions. You have to gather detailed information from the faces. And this is all different when you ask people to just look around in this image, right? This is supposedly the task-free condition. There is no task. You're just looking around. You're just seeing what the scene is about. A paradigm that a lot of people use to study serial and parallel processing and attention processing is visual search. You basically get a target, and your task is to find that target, right? We're going to do an experiment here. The trials are usually either target present or two conditions, right? So target present or target absent. I usually mix them up, right? Otherwise, there wouldn't be a task if you didn't have both conditions, right? It can't be always present or always absent. And the number of the items in the image usually changes when they are simple displays. So if the target is present, say present. Yeah, ready? So if it's absent, you say absent. Present. All right, so here's some example of what you would probably call easy search tasks, right? These are the three trials that I showed you. Do you think when we added distractors going from this condition to this condition, did it make it harder? Not really, right? It was still kind of easy to do. Was this
Because of the color, there's only
yeah, exactly. Hmm? Yeah. Yeah. So how about the absent? Was the absent search harder than the present search? Again, not really, right? These are all easy searches. Um, and one could argue that in a way you're doing this all in parallel, that you're kind of processing everything in parallel and you're able to do this very quickly, right? So if I plot the effect of set size, in this case, is the number of objects in the scene. We call that set size. And show the search time, it's probably flat, right? With adding more objects, it's not going to get more difficult. It's somewhat very similar for target absent and target present, maybe a little longer it takes for you. This is the reaction time. It takes a little longer for you to say target absent because you want to make sure that there is no target in the scene. Now let's do a couple of other search. And then again, present, absent, like as quickly as possible. The target is still a red vertical bar. Absent. Present. Present. So this is a little different, right? Do you think does adding distractors going from this condition to that condition that were both present, does it make the search harder? Yes. It looks like that having more objects makes it harder for you to say whether it was present or not. How about it being, is the absent search harder or than the present search? Yes. Yeah. So the target absent search is harder than the target present search. It takes you longer. Now, the pattern that we would look at, if we look at the search time versus set size, you would expect something like this, where let's say in the target present condition, in both target present and absent, when you add to the number of objects, the search time gets harder. But it looks like when you add more, the target absence gets even harder than the target present, meaning that for the same set size, for the same number of objects in the scene, target absence would take longer. So basically, the set size effect is larger for target absence search than target. So, if those of you who are taking the stats, there would be an interaction effect here, right? Meaning that they're both getting harder with more objects, but one condition is getting disproportionately harder. So there's an interaction effect. Okay, so now we saw two different patterns, right? One of them one of them on the left was what we call the um, the easier case, where the search looked like it was parallel in some ways. And we saw the case on the right where the search was serial, right? And I give you an example here of something that you've done probably. Okay. So this is a where is Waldo task. And I think all of you have done a where is Waldo task, right? Uh,
Oh, I see.
okay. You all see it? Okay. So some of you are still searching. Okay, so it is here, right? So is this a serial or parallel search? Serial, right? It takes a long time to find the Waldo here. It's not something that you could do very quickly. You cannot just look at the image and say if it's there or not. Do you think it would take you longer if the Waldo was absent than present? Yeah, right. You would expect to spend a much longer time to say that it's absent, right? Why is this search difficult?
So many things are simple for.
Yeah, so there are so many objects here that have a lot of features shared with Waldo, right? Like the striking. What are the features of Waldo, right?
Red horizontal stripes, nobody, they're either vertical or a different color, but there's no, I'm looking, oh wait, no, there's one.
So we have red horizontal stuff. And we have the blue pants in a lot of places. Um, so you could see that Waldo is not a simple feature, right? Waldo is a combination of features. And those features are similar. Now again, that what makes Waldo, and again, this is something we talked about in the context of a specificity and distributed code. What makes Waldo is not just the striped shirt. These are philosophical questions. It's not just the striped shirt or the blue pants, right? What is it? Or the hat. It's what? It's all of them, right? It's a combination of features, and that's what makes it a difficult task. That you have to detect a combination of features. So in the context of, so there are specific things about Waldo that has a blue pants and that has, you know, red and white striped shirt and a hat. But neither of those things by itself will give you Waldo. It's the combination of those features that you have to detect in order to say, okay, this is Waldo. And that's the point we're going to emphasize. So in the case that we said search is parallel, that you could do this in parallel, we had this condition where you had one red vertical among other green vertical bars. So what does that tell you? How many, so what is the feature? So what makes the target in this case? What's that? The color. What makes the target in this case is the color. Are there any other objects in this scene that share that? No, right? So in parallel, it's a single feature. And because it's a single feature, you could process the entire thing in parallel. You could just say, okay, I'm seeing only one thing that's different. So the feature level processing is enough. You don't have to combine features with each other in order to recognize the object. So adding more green bars is not going to change that fact, right? It's not, if you add more green bars, there is still a single feature that separates the target from all the distractors. And because of that, the search stays the same. The time that to do the search stays the same. Now, how do these patterns relate to serial processing? All right, I'm looking at the time. Maybe we'll take a break for 10 minutes and then we'll come back. We'll start at 7:10. How you doing?
How are you?
Oh, wait, I have to pause this. So, the pattern of behavior that we saw when the search is serial, or the attention behavior is serial, is that when we add more objects, the search becomes slower, right? So when we talk about why would that be the case, well, I wanted to show you that in the example of Waldo example, and the fact that you have to look at different objects in order to be able to do this task, right? In this case, we had, well, it's still red vertical bar as the target. And what we saw is that you can't really do this task by looking at the whole thing at once, right? It looks like what we're doing is that we're looking at individual objects. And when the task becomes, when you increase the number of objects in the scene, you make the task more difficult, but because, well, people have to look at every single one of them. So this, in a way, when the target is absent, you would have a behavior like the one on the right, or either of these, right? Because there is no target here. In order for you to say that there is no target here, in the example of like where's Waldo also, when there is no target, you have to look at almost every object in the scene in order to know there is no target, right? Search in that case becomes exhaustive. Like you exhaustively search, you make sure there is no, right? Whenever you're looking, again, search behavior is something we do a lot every day, every minute, if you pay attention to it, you're doing this behavior a lot, right? You're searching for your keys, a lot of you searching for stuff in your bags, or I'm searching for something on the screen of my phone for a specific app because it has a certain shape, like I know the shape of the logo of the app that I'm looking for, right? You could be in the street searching for a taxi. You could be in a restaurant looking at the menu. You want to know what the salmon option is. You're looking for the word salmon, right? You do this a lot in a sense that, as I said, if you become aware of how much search behavior you're doing, it's, we do it, every minute almost. So imagine searching for your keys and you looked at other places and then you open the drawer and you're looking for it. You're going to do an exhaustive search, right? Sometimes you don't do it initially, but then when you think, okay, this must be the place, you could do an exhaustive search to make sure, well, the keys are not in this drawer. And that's a target absent search. And there's a bigger slope to it because you're looking at everything, meaning that when you increase the number of objects, you have to do more. Now, in the case when the target is present, then you do not spend as much time. Why? Why would that be? you find the target probably, right? In a lot of cases, you find the target with almost, say, half of the number of fixations, half of the number of orientation of attention, you find the target. Now, this is the case where the where search is not guided. And again, that's a concept that I'm not going to spend time on. But a lot of time we don't do unguided search, meaning that we just don't randomly look in a space, looking at every object. You kind of have some top-down knowledge of where the object would be, right? If you're looking for your keys, you're potentially looking at some surfaces, right? And that narrows down the search space. You're not going to search, in the air, and it's like all of those things, all of those heuristics that we know, what we know about the objects, our prior knowledge builds into how we do search. It guides our behavior and it makes the search space narrower. Even if that wasn't the case, then because you find the target most of the time within half of the number of fixations, then you're going to stop there. So that's why when people plot the search behavior with the number of objects and how much each of them, how much time it takes to find the target, you see a slope like this. That for target present, for the same number of objects, you take almost half of the time, or not half of the time. It's, these are more nonlinear relationships, but the slope of increase with more object is smaller when the target is present for that reason. Does that make sense to everyone? I think I said what I wanted to say here. All right. So based on these findings, there was an influential theory that to this date people, use to understand attention behavior, and it's called feature integration theory. And this is somewhat what I was trying to describe with the Waldo example. Sometimes your target has only a single feature, and that single feature is different from everything in the scene. Sometimes it has multiple features. And that multiple features, one of those features is so different from the surrounding, right? So let's say if you put a Waldo in an environment that everyone is wearing green shirts, right? They could be people, they could be wearing blue pants. But the fact that there is a single feature that separates Waldo from everything else in that environment, it would still make it a parallel search. So it's not that the object has multiple features, it's that do you need to integrate the features in order to perform the task? That's the key here. Do you need to consider all the features together in order to perform the task? And that's the problem with the Waldo example, right? That's what makes it difficult. You have to consider all those features together, right? There are objects that there are people who have blue pants, there are people that have red, shirt, there are people who have hat, there are people who have, two of those things, but all of them together is what. So the theory, the feature integration theory, says that attention binds distributed features into objects. So why are features distributed? This is because of what we talked about, right? If we talked about the modularity in the brain as we were discussing the ventral pathway, we said, okay, orientations could be detected here, colors could be detected here, maybe there's some identity information here, maybe there's motion perception there. So if these information are to some extent scattered, right, how do they all come together, right? We said, well, yes, there's distributed coding, but there could be cells that integrate across all of those things. But if you have a lot of features, if there are other red objects in the environment, if there are other brown objects in the environment, then there is a chance that you would mistake them, that you do not assign the right distributed features together in order to create a coherent object. So the features of objects, let's say form, color, motion, are scattered throughout the cortex, you could say, right? There are other features. In this case, we're talking about visual features, so a lot of them are in the visual cortex. Binding refers to the process by which these separated signals are combined to form a unified percept of an object. So that's the binding problem. Now, if I have a single object in front of me, that would not be a problem, right? Every feature that I am perceiving at that moment in my brain belongs to that object. If I only have a single object, every feature that I'm processing at that moment belongs to that object. If it's a red feature, if it's a round feature, if it's a certain imagination of a taste, whatever it is, belongs to that object. So I would not have a problem potentially aggregating those distributed features to form a specific percept, to form a coherent percept. But what if there are other objects that share those features? Like in this case, what if the round, orange is next to another round object? What is the redness is shared? What if there are other objects? What is, parts of this is green and there's a little yellow here and whatnot? All of these things, when you look at it, all of these things are processed in parallel to some extent. So their features are available in the brain. But attention tries to bind all those features, tag all those features together to create one object. Okay? So, according to feature integration theory, there are two stages of processing. This goes back to our parallel and serial processing. So there is a pre-attentive process, pre-attentive before attention, which is parallel. And in this process, individual features are processed separately, right? You could say, well, the color is processed separately, the orientation is processed separately, maybe the shape is processed separately. There are individual features. And these features are available for pretty much all the objects that we have in our environment. But in order to engage with one object, you want to, for me to reach for an object or answer a question about a specific object, I would have to have a serial process that integrates all the features of that object into some coherent whole, coherent percept. And that's where the focused attention or selective attention stages. Features are bound into coherent objects by application of attention. Do you all kind of understand what this theory trying to capture, right? So in an environment like this, again, this is related to the idea of, well, the Desimon study that we talked about earlier in terms of, well, what if you have multiple objects in your receptive field? Well, maybe the receptive field shrinks around that object. So in a way, when you attend to an object, if the cells try to predominantly process and represent that object, you're focusing your attention on it, and it makes it easier for those features to be bound into a percept. But in parallel, a lot of these features are available, right? If I'm looking at an environment and I'm attending to a person here, you could potentially decode some features in my brain that are representing a person here, another person there, in earlier visual areas. But if I'm attending to a person at a higher level, then this sort of gatekeeping allows for certain features to be bound together, certain distributed features to be bound together in order to create that person. And that comes at a cost for other stuff. Again, you never forget, right? That there is a cost for attention. Somebody else is paying the cost that you're attending to something. Attention is the glue that binds features into objects. Does that make sense to everyone?
Does it have anything to do with occlusion, like what you're doing when you're binding? I mean, that you're filling in the object. I mean, this is sort of the same kind of idea.
In some ways, one
parallel process.
So let's say you're saying occlusion, right? What if, like, from here, I'm not seeing, let's say, your legs, right? But I imagine it, they're there. So if I have a percept of an object, right? So an alternative theory would be, well, if you perceive an object, then you could generate a template of that object, right? I could generate a template of a human and then assume that, well, those parts should exist too, unless I see otherwise. And in a way, you're binding features to a template, which is an alternative way of thinking about this. This is not this theory, but there are alternative theories around generation, where you have these top-down templates that you generate, right? If I close your eye, you imagine a human, there's a template in that human that looks a certain way. And that template, you try to match features to that template. So it could be that, well, the recognition comes first, right? And when you recognize something, you have a template, and that template you match different, and you try to bind those features using that template. This theory doesn't really address that. That's an alternative way of thinking about it, where, as I said, you see something, you recognize it, that recognition brings out a template of that object, and then you match all the features that are you see and features that are missing or occluded to that template. In this theory is mostly about how spatial attention allows you to glue those features without sorts of a top-down reconstructive template.
When the glue means what? Like it sticks.
Glue is a metaphor in a sense that if you have distributed features, now, yeah, so there is an assumption here that you don't, that this theory is, so this theory is on the foundation of this very simple stimuli, right? These very simple stimuli have color and orientation. That's all they have, right? And you could say, well, what if there is a map of colors in V4, retinotopic map of colors that shows, okay, this area is red, this area is green, but has no orientation information? What if there is an orientation map in V2 that has no color information? It just says, okay, this orientation here, this orientation here. How do I recognize a red vertical bar at that point? Well, I'm going to look at this location in the retinotopic map and say, okay, what is the color in this location? I get the color from this map. What is the orientation in this map? Well, orientation is this way. I get the orientation from that map. I glue these two things and I say, okay, I'm looking at the red horizontal bar. Then I go to a new location in my retinotopic map, get the orientation from one map, get the color from another map, and I glue them and I say, well, this is a green horizontal bar. So that's what it means. It means that you have to travel in that retinotopic map in your brain in order to glue those features together from coming from different maps.
Is memory part of this or
not? Not exactly. No, you're gluing in this sense means just features from different maps being temporarily glued together to create this coherent percept. It has nothing to do, in a sense, with whether you are planting a memory with it or something like that. But the foundation, you have to understand this theory and its foundation of the kind of experiments that were being done at the time. At the time, they were working with these stuff. But now I've shown you some examples. Do you remember the example of a selectivity of an IT cell? It looks much more complex than that, right? It's not just responding to a specific orientation or a color. It's much more complex than that. It's a combination of features. But it's still, there is a relevance for this theory. There is an allure to this theory because it matches people's experience in a lot of ways. In a way that we all experience that when we attend to something, that's when it all comes together. And before that, it's more of a pre-attentive thing. Before that, it's more of a, jumble, and in some ways. So there is, the theory in its original form may not be widely accepted, but in essence, in the spirit, I think it's still, there's value to it. In a sense that in a sense that there are certain things that are done in parallel, that there are certain things that are done in serial, but we could argue over where those boundaries are, where that line is when things are parallel and things are serial. In the context of these experiments that we talked about, well, you do not need to integrate features in this task, right? Why is that? If I want to perform this task, if I want to say if there is a target object or not, do I have to integrate any features? Do I have glue? Do I have to glue features or no? Why not? Yeah, so I could do this based on a map, right? If I have color maps, and color maps have show me where it's red, where it's green. I have orientation maps where they show me where it's vertical, where it's horizontal. I could do this task based on just a single map. The color map is enough. I could look at the color map in my brain, retinotopic color map, and say, well, there is something that is red in there, and my target was red, so I'm good, right? Sometimes if you have a car and then you go look for a park, you parked your car somewhere in a parking lot, and your car is red, and you look, and there's only one red car, so you know what your car is, right? Because based on just that color map, without having to go and glue features for individual objects, you could perform that task. And that's why it's fast. That's why it's parallel, because the assumption is that that pre-attentive creation of those maps is in parallel, right? This is important sentence. That pre-attentive creation of those feature maps is done in parallel. It does not require serial processing. So a parallel pre-attentive analysis tells you that there are lots of objects in the display that are green and vertical, but only one object that is red. You have that information with pre-attentive processing. The presence of the feature red therefore signals the target. So you don't need any focused attention here. You could just examine a pre-attentive map in order to know there is a target. Now, in this case, well, can you do that? What are the maps that we have here? We have an orientation feature map that is a lot of vertical and horizontal in that retinotopic map. We have a color parallel map that is red and green. Can you tell us if there is a target here based on one of those maps or no? If the color is red vertical, based on each of those maps. Yes or no? If I have these parallel maps that are feature maps that are generated in parallel, let's say orientation maps, that tells you what is the orientation at each location in the space. I have another map that's a color map, and it tells you what's the color at each position in this space. Can you do this task using either of those maps? Can you tell us? Okay, so you cannot, right? You cannot do this task by either of those maps. If you want to tell me if there is a red vertical bar here, you cannot do that with either of those maps. Why? Well, if the map tells you there are vertical stuff, well, the target is not the only vertical thing. If the map tells you there are red stuff here, well, the target is not the only red thing. The target is a red vertical object. And in order to perform that task, you have to look at individual ones, right? You have to look at one object, say, well, this is a red horizontal because I'm gluing the features for red from one map to the horizontal features from another map, and I realize it's a red horizontal. Come here, it's a green vertical, right? And then you so on, go on. In order for you to combine these features from different maps, you have to go to individual objects. Does that make sense? Does that make sense that why you have to do this serially in order to perform this task?
What if you had three horizontals would that just make it a more complex serial process?
Green horizontal
Yeah,
and
there are
not,
only green verticals there, but they're red, all red, and the target's the red vertical, right?
so wait a second, are you saying
They're
all
only-
the,
I'm saying if you added green horizontals to that, would it just, it would still be even another layer of complexity? Yeah,
if you add green horizontal type, like it depends, are you increasing the number of objects or not?
yeah, but you're,
Yeah.
you know, you're making it even harder.
Yeah, it
Maybe not,
doesn't
I don't know.
change the
You're not
fact.
looking for green, the task is to identify the red vertical target. Um,
So what if I replace all the red, um let's see, what if I replace all the green vertical with green horizontal?
that would make it easier.
Yeah, why would it make it easier?
You would, everything would be horizontal except the
Yeah,
target.
so you could use that orientation map to do the task. So that would make it a parallel search.
But if you had both, I'm saying.
Yeah, both would be
green and
hard.
red would keep it serial.
Keep it serial, yeah. Yeah. Okay, so you kind of get the intuition for feature integration theory and what attention does, and according to this theory, you get the impression of what it means for processes to be parallel and processes to be serial. Yeah, pre-attentive, post-attentive, they're kind of similarly mapping to that. These are not clean concepts. Different people use them differently, but you want to have an intuition of what they mean. And you could see why feature integration theory would be able to predict the behavioral pattern in this task. Okay. So an alternative way of thinking about this, and you'll come across this as you see visual attention research, is the concept of saliency. So when you are searching for a target feature, it's a top-down task-driven thing. But you always have to consider, can this be done just through bottom-up saliency? And what is bottom-up saliency? Well, let's say I have, a light blue among darker blue stuff, and I have a red among blue stuff. You would say that this target is much more salient, visually salient, right? So as I was saying, if you are searching for your car and your car is not red, but you're in a parking lot and there is a red car, it is likely that that red car captures your attention, right? It's likely that an object that is salient, even if it's not a task relevant object to you, would capture your attention. It's just, we are driven to salient stuff, right? If it's something is louder, something has a different color from its surrounding, it kind of attracts us. So this theory says that the visual system computes local measures of feature contrast or saliency. So instead of what you saw about feature integration theory, it still says you have this pre-attentive process. So the pre-attentive process gives you features. You get color features, you get orientation features, but you do not perceive them as just color orientation features. You also perceive them as saliency features, meaning that, well, if there is a red bar among other bars, you are likely to see this as more salient. Or when you have one orientation versus other orientation, then it's more salient, right? If there's a scene with a lot of things going in one direction and one at a different direction, it would be salient. In this case, I'm showing color, and a lot of this happens through lateral inhibition, but we do not have to talk about that. Now, what is the effect of that? Well, you could say, again, this is an old photo. There are much better saliency measurements now. You could say, well, areas that have a different features from their surrounding would be more salient in an image. Yeah, just about contrast, right? Whether it's orientation contrast, whether it's color contrast, right? Um, Objects that are salient would look different, right? In this case, I'm showing this figure. Well, this area has a very monotonic, features. This area is kind of monotonic. The areas that have a different color when the orientation changes, or these clouds in a simple background, right? These are the more salient things in this environment. They just look visually different from their surroundings. So how does this model explain the patterns of behavior that we saw? Well, it says when you have a red vertical bar among green bars, sure, you do pre-attentive processing, but after that pre-attentive processing, it comes the saliency, right? This object is very salient in this environment. If you have 5 green bars or 10 green bars or 7, 12, or 17 green bars, it doesn't make a difference. This object is very salient. So you could quickly find it. And you could say, well, it's present. Just the fact that it's so salient in that environment, it makes it an object that you attend to. Now, we have, in this case, it's a simple color, but you can imagine that if you are looking at an environment, and you'll see studies like this, one face that has, let's say, angry emotions is more salient than faces that have happy emotions. It's just a more salient visual input that we're kind of used to. And that makes one of them more salient, like one object more salient than other objects. So depending on your environment and depending on the history of the animal and everything, it could be that certain objects become more salient. In this case, we're looking at very simple oriented bars. So a red bar is just more salient among green bars. And regardless of how many of the green bars you have, these objects remain salient. And it doesn't matter if it's present or absent, right? It's just easy. Yeah. So parallel in this case means that, well, yes, you are processing the features in parallel. And in one of those feature maps, the target is much more salient than the distractors. So it stands out. It attracts your attention.
Is this related to like pop out?
Yes. So this is a pop-out search technically. So it pops out to you, basically. That's what that means. That's another way of saying it that is very salient. When something pops out to you in an environment, like that means that it's very salient, visually salient, in contrast to its surrounding. That's what that means. Now, how would that theory explain this? Well, in this case, you don't have anything that's salient anymore. Why is that? Nothing is super salient anymore in this environment. Well, because if you look at the orientation map, well, if you have a red vertical, there are green vertical bars around it. So in that map, it's not salient. If you have the color map, in the color map, you have red, and there are other red objects around it. So this target has objects that in either of those maps have shared features with it. And when you have shared features, it cannot be salient. Saliency arises from one feature being very different from its surrounding. That's what makes something pop out. When they have a feature that is very different from their surrounding. Right? Can you all, yeah? Does that make sense? So If they don't have any features that is very different from their surrounding, then they're not going to pop up. It's so saliency usually, but some things are more salient than other things. Saliency is not a, you know, 0 and 1 types of concept. It's like graded. That some objects are more salient than others. Those are more salient than others. It's a graded thing, depending on the environment, right? For us, we're social animals. Like faces are very salient. If I show you an image, if there are faces in that image, all of you would be attending to the face. It's just salient. When you do eye tracking studies with people looking at a movie, if there is a face in the frame, the eye is on the face. If there's an expectation of a face coming into it, the eyes will move there. Like we're always, right? That's just a salient object to us. So it is dependent on the context too. So and this gets a little tricky, right? I'm calling this saliency a bottom-up thing. Oh, you have these pre-attended features, and these features are salient. But now I'm saying, no, you could be salient to a face, or you could be salient to something higher level concept. So it's a combination of things. It's not as simple as saying, well, these are just pre-attended features, and in one of them it's salient. No, there are more higher level features that could be salient as well. Any questions? The saliency map is produced by basically finding contrast in each of these feature maps. So in this case, you could look at, well, let's look at all the colors. You could look at the pixel value of the color and be like, okay, where is it? Is this pixel value different from its surrounding? Is this pixel value different from its surrounding? Then you have a color saliency map. Orientation, like, well, this orientation is different from the orientation here, so you get some contrast. And then depending if there's motion, you have motion too. You have like intensity also. Oh, this is more intense, has more intensity than that. So on the pixel level, you look at how different they are from their surrounding, then you average those maps, and then you get a saliency. Yeah. So you basically, it's a process you could automatize easily. Yeah. Okay, so saliency maps, again, we're showing it here in a simple concept, but you'll come across them in the studies talking about maybe more emotional stimuli or emotional experiences or something like that. So it's a concept that goes beyond just using visual percepts. A lot of people use, oh, what's salient, what's not salient, but I'm just showing you in the context of vision because this is the, I guess, the study case that we have in this course for you to understand this concept, but you could expect it to see it in this other topic too. All right, see you all next week. Think about your topic, get in touch with your TAs.